you. I want to tell you a story about a couple that both work for the federal government. Earlier this month, the spouse of an Army service member seeking approval to go work overseas for the State Department contacted the Oversight Committee because she was being forced to decide between quitting her very successful federal career for the State Department or returning to Washington, D.C. to continue her federal service without her husband and without her 2 children. Her agency was fighting desperately to maintain her expertise and was perfectly fine with her performing her duties from overseas with her husband, who was in the Army, who was being relocated over there. Luckily, we were able to help make sure that her overseas telework request was approved. Now, is that someone who's not really working? Do we want to tell her to get back to work? Her situation is common for thousands of families in the federal workforce where you have one member who's in the military, who's being relocated, the other who might be working at a site in Washington, who is now able to work out the terms of service under the telework policy. But that's precisely an element of the policy that will be crushed by the legislation that's been brought forward without the benefit of a single hearing in the Oversight and Accountability Committee, despite the fact that our colleagues have said that they will only bring legislation to the floor after there's been a hearing, and we're just a few weeks into the session, and yet this legislation comes forward without hearing from anybody like this constituent who is being put in such a tough posture, or the directors of the agencies, or the head of the Office of Personnel Management, who's in charge of actually supervising and coordinating overall telework policy and making the annual report to Congress. Telework is a vital tool for the government to recruit and retain and grow the talented workforce we need to make the federal government work. It ensures the federal workers can serve the nation even during disasters. And again, it was the pre-existing telework policy that established the infrastructure that made for such a relatively smooth transition when we got into the pandemic. But I have to say that denials of telework for the spouses of military personnel are still common, and they are consequential, and they would be pervasive if the legislation passed. So I hope that all of our colleagues will reject this and at the very least send it back to the Oversight Committee for some real hearings so we can talk about what this really means. I will reserve my time.